So, as I often mention at the beginning of the talk, these talks are about a very particular topic. The topic is peace of mind in daily living. And peace of mind in daily living on a continuous, unbroken basis, meaning that that peace of mind doesn't continually get interrupted by suffering. It's suffering that is the opposite of peace of mind. Peace of mind on a continuous, unbroken basis turns out to be the human happiness that is available. And that's pretty important because intuitively the human being is seeking happiness, whether they are conscious of it or not. They are on a quest in life, following a certain strategy in their system. And really that strategy is because they think it will make them happy. And so when you look at the strategy as it's playing out to inform you, or whether it's your own strategy or someone else's strategy, to inform us as to what the idea of happiness is, because the strategy will tell us what the idea must be. We see it's about outcomes. We see it's about moving towards an outcome that we believe, when that happens, when that is achieved, then everything will be okay. And so there's a fairly compelling push in the human being to follow, to seek outcomes in the future. And because the deeply ingrained belief is that my happiness is to be found in outcomes, when outcomes, meaning circumstance, situation in life, is not in line with our expectations, when life turns out to be pain instead of the pleasure that we're seeking, that particular form of outcome, that particular expression of life, is received as an attack on who I am. So what I mean by an attack on who I am, it feels like this is unacceptable to me, to what I know myself as. And that unacceptability is felt as a deep uncomfortableness and resistance to the situation as it's happening. So remember, the talks are just descriptions. They're descriptions that hopefully you can hear as a description and then say, okay, I have to go and check this out. I have to follow the pointer and see if I agree with it. And if you agree with it, and in order to agree with it, there is usually a fairly lengthy sort of contemplation and set of thinking that reveals a lot of subsets of the topic that we haven't thought about. And that extensive thing basically allows an understanding of a topic to start settling in a deep way. So the talks are concepts, they're pointers, they're descriptions about dynamics that we tend to be not very educated on. They're not dynamics that get covered in maths or English or social sciences. And so we go through life without much of a roadmap towards that side of ourselves. And so the talks here are basically information about that aspect that isn't available in that many places in life. It's very important that the descriptions are heard as descriptions, not taken as some sort of truth, not taken as some philosophy that has to be just believed or rote learned, but rather something for you to investigate and put ticks next to it and go, yes, yes, that's accurate. That's how I'm going to start seeing it from now, because I now see that's how it is. And then you look at something that maybe was in front of you for your whole life, but you had no vision for it, no explanation, no understanding of the dynamics that were sort of maybe hidden beneath the surface. So as we think about it, we start to understand the dynamics. And then when a feeling arises, which has always arisen in our life, we might actually be able to relate to that feeling differently. We might be able to understand where it comes from, or what sort of feeling it is. And then that movement becomes quite effortless. I mean, when you see, when you hear the music from an ice cream truck, you know what it is. You hear it and you know what it is. When your mobile phone beeps, you hear it and you know what it is. It doesn't take you any effort to think about what it is. And similarly, once we've understood certain dynamics, when we've seen what certain feelings are at their core, then when they arise, we automatically know, oh, there's a form of suffering. And then more specifically, oh, there's some blame, or there's some shame, or there's some expectation, or there's some anxiety. So very important for the seeker to investigate what is described for themselves based on your own life experience. So where did I start off? The talks are about peace of mind and daily living. So that's a concept. It's a description. The talks are about peace of mind and daily living. And peace of mind and daily living, according to this framework of concepts, peace of mind in daily living, when it arises on a continuous, unbroken basis, is the happiness that is available for the human being in this life. And as a concept, that might sound unsatisfying. Someone would say, no, that's not the happiness. Another important thing to try and remember is that there's this phenomena, which is we can think about what happiness is and have a concept about it, have our opinion about it. But often when we learn from looking at something, it's a very different set of explanations that we get, because we're essentially saying, oh, I need to, like I have something, for example, an inner state, maybe, that we haven't put much interest in describing. And someone says, what is that inner state you talk about sometimes? And you say, well, actually, I don't know. I mean, I just know that it is my inner state, but I haven't actually sat with it or investigated it, really felt it, to be able to put words on it. And we can. Just give me a minute. Let's see. And we go into the inner state. You feel what it is. And then you can start describing. You go, actually, the funny thing is it doesn't have a feeling. It isn't a feeling I can put my finger on, like pleasure or joy or love. And so then you're describing it based on being directly in contact with that which you are describing. Now, that's very different to when we hypothesize about something. And so a lot of when we talk about human happiness, this is why getting guidance from maybe someone who is able to feel from a different vantage point is so useful, because it can give us some hints about which path to take in order to develop our own experience of it. So hearing from someone else what their experience of happiness is not useful to give you happiness because of the description. it's not useful to give you happiness, so you just try and imagine it into existence. Why it's useful is it can inspire thinking that eventually turns into your own experience of it. And according to my perspective, that happens because a certain type of thinking, a certain attitude towards life, a certain structure that we can call our identity is undermined by looking at these structures in the detail that we normally don't. And so as we see things, we start to understand, we understand so much that leads to change. So what do I mean by we can hypothesize about something, which is very different to getting a description of it from first-hand experience? An example that comes to mind is, imagine if, I don't know, back in the Stone Age, a person came across a tractor sitting in the field, or for that matter, a computer sitting on the seat of the tractor. And they look at it and they've got no notion in their mind about how machines work, that a machine powered by a fuel can do work on its own, that things can move without being propelled by a human being. And so they might have an idea, they'll have an opinion about the tractor or an opinion about the computer without obviously knowing. And so they're completely oblivious to the capacities of a computer to provide visual and sound and calculate things and follow programs and do all the things that computers do. Completely oblivious that a machine can lift heavy things and can do work because of its design and its structure. And so they might look at it and they'll say, oh, this is what I think that is. Someone else will say, no, don't be ridiculous. This is what it is. And they'll have all sorts of ideas that the likelihood is none of them would be particularly accurate. And if it was revealed when the tractor is fired up and starts working, assuming someone from not the Stone Age appeared to get it all going and do the work, then there's a capacity for it to be known, to be described based on being in direct contact with whatever is being described, being the tractor. And happiness is a bit like that, in that we have ideas about it when maybe we haven't experienced it. And so listening to the description, so someone comes down and says, hey, this is a machine. This uses fuel and turns it into different forms of energy. So it's a transmutation of one energy into a mechanical energy, for example, or a heat or whatever. And so that's the correct explanation based on having access to the machine and an understanding about it. And if we listen to those descriptions, what can happen is our ideas can start to fall away. Our ideas that might be misguided, and we tend not to realize that our ideas are misguided. We have this idea about what the tractor does, and we hold that as truth because it's my idea, and the way that the psychological self arises, it says, I am true, and what I think is true. And so we hold on to ideas about happiness, even if we've heard these talks for hundreds of times, without realizing it. Somewhere in the system, maybe not that hidden, we may still have our idea of what spiritual seeking is about, what happiness is about. And so if we hear these concepts and we realize, oh, this is a concept from a different place. This is a concept from a, let's say, a more informed place relative to where I stand. So none of this is meant to be about, arrogance or pride or ego. It's just, I can appreciate getting informed about mountain climbing if I'm about to embark on a mountain hike by someone who has climbed the mountain. There will be no doubt things they could tell me that will be very useful because they have navigated that path. They have experience and have the capacity to see the mountain from a different perspective than I can. So I hope that sort of discussion can help open us up to hearing these words differently, hearing these words in a way that allow a thinking about them, especially a thinking that allows us maybe to see what is being pointed at for ourselves, which in turn can lead to a change of experience, maybe little bit by little bit, and that each time there's a change in experience, a little bit more of the overall vision opens up. And it's a snowballing effect. Something small opens up and a new thought can expand as a result of having a new feeling, a new experience, a new perspective. And then that continues to deliver this expanding change. So interspersed into my explanations about the concepts, the teachings and how they work and how hopefully your thinking about them happens such that it starts to reveal for yourself slightly different perspectives, and then that builds on itself. Interspersed in that talk, I've been speaking about happiness. What is happiness for the human being? By and large, the belief that has been ingrained by life, by our growth process from the point of conception to birth and then development as a baby and then a toddler and an adolescent and so on. The idea is best I can hope for in life is pleasure. The best I can hope for is improving my situation. The best I can hope for is to have love, and love is a form of pleasure. Pleasure, 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 pleasure. That is what will complete me. That will make my time on earth at some point feel like it is acceptable when circumstance is good enough. Now, I'm not trying to downplay the significance of pleasure over pain. There is a benefit to pleasure over pain. One is pleasurable and the other one isn't. But to mistake that as being the source of our happiness, to mistake that as human happiness, is to essentially have a form of ignorance. And I don't mean ignorance in a way that's meant to be rude. Ignorance in the spiritual seeking context means a misunderstanding, an error, basically wrong information, wrong belief, wrong idea, wrong perspective. Not wrong as in you have failed, but rather this is the way life tends to create us, such that that becomes the ingrained belief at first, that because on a gross level, pleasure seems to be the alternative to pain, and they seem to be the two options in the circumstance of life. And so it makes sense that the biological organism, based on fairly gross stimuli, pleasure and pain, picks and says, pleasure is better than pain. I want life to be pleasure, 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 pleasure. And so that becomes its strategy. Is I as a doer, I as the one that control my life, that is in charge of how successful it is, am going to make it pleasure, 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 pleasure. It's understandable, like it gets that in place. What we may not realize is that that strategy is futile as far as human happiness goes. It tends to leave us continually disappointed. It tends to leave us in virtually the same place as we started, which is feeling disconnected, feeling discontent with life. In fact, feeling uncomfortable with ourselves. And so the seeking for pleasure is what we think will alleviate the uncomfortableness with oneself, because we get a short-term pleasure explosion, and that feels good. And so we keep pursuing that, thinking that maybe that's that we have this uncomfortableness with oneself because we haven't got enough pleasure. And inevitably that uncomfortableness doesn't go away even when we get the pleasures that we have been seeking. And so for some people that becomes apparent. It becomes obvious, the uncomfortableness, the futility, the fact that I have received pleasure. I know what pleasure is. And still, when I get pleasure, that doesn't create a magical solution to my unhappiness or my uncomfortableness with myself in life on an ongoing basis. It doesn't provide a magic pill that sorts out how I feel about myself for the rest of my life. And if that penny drops, and if at the same time as that penny dropping, we find ourselves exposed to different information that says, hey, that's not where your happiness is to be found. Happiness for the human being is not outcome-based. Happiness for the dependent on how someone speaks to you, how someone treats you, how society is structured, whether things go your way. All of those things are outcomes. And we're very involved and very attached to those things because the human being has developed with the deeply ingrained belief that my happiness is to be found in outcomes. And so when society is doing things that aren't delivering our preferences, when family members or strangers or people at work talk to you in a way that isn't pleasant, decide things that are not in favor of you, require you to do things that will make you tired or things that you don't like, and so on and so on, that is felt like an attack on my sense of where happiness will be found. Because remember, the sense of self says happiness will be found when life is pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. When that spell is broken, and eventually, when that spell is broken for long enough, we start to feel the real happiness. The unfolding of life is seen as inevitable, meaning we understand that life is always going to unfold. There is always going to be changing circumstance, sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. That my happiness, this would be experiential, that my happiness isn't dependent on how life unfolds. We know life will unfold. We learn, we know, we understand at that time that I have to keep making decisions, and that I will make decisions ideally when we're just interested in a decision for ourselves, without thinking that a decision that I make in this moment needs to be the same decision that everyone else makes. The strategy or the priorities I have are priorities for me, in a particular moment. I don't know what I'm going to decide in 3 months' time. I might think I know, which is to overlook the fact that in 3 months something will happen and I will be very particular, meaning one way. And I don't know what that one way is. I might be tired when it happens, whatever happens in 3 months. And so my decision will be influenced by the fact that I might be feeling tired, or I might be feeling afraid, or I might be feeling excited. I might have certain values, and I don't know what those are. And so life becomes much simpler. I said, life is going to unfold. In order for life to keep unfolding, it requires the human being to function, to make decisions, to pick options. And that we will do that according to our very specific design in that moment. So to realize, I don't know, if someone says, what would you do if this such and such happened? You go, I don't know. What do you mean you don't know? Well, I don't know. I'll know when it happens. So at some point, the most important thing is to have when we have our own experience of happiness outside of pleasure, then that creates a new feedback loop of experience that allows that understanding that my happiness isn't to be found in pleasure, my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes, to undo any of the remaining psychological belief that has been put in place after years of looking at life a certain way. And so in looking at life a certain way and approaching it a certain way, being driven to pursue pleasure, having an identity in place that feels added to or subtracted from, depending on whether it receives pleasure or it receives the absence of the pleasure at once, or pain. That strengthens this psychological me that is convinced that it requires pleasure in order to be more complete. And that psychological me basically is what we could call the false sense of self, a sense of self that covers up a deeper connection that is available inside the human being, a connection to source. And if that connection to source starts revealing itself, that's when we start having this sense that everything is okay, as long as there is this abiding in the self, abiding in I am, abiding in what I truly am. And that true self lies outside of the realm of thought. It lies outside of the realm of concept that has been turned into truths, like the concept based on an experience that we might have that pleasure is good. And then a concept gets put in place, not honestly, but based on it feeling good. Oh, this is what I need. And we don't even know that that concept has formed in the body-mind organism. Something feels good, and then the concept forms, this is what I need. It isn't held as just a concept. So just a concept basically means it's a thought form about something, and it can be right, it could be wrong. And once we realize that our thinking is always concept, and that those concepts, those ideas about things are informed by the information that we receive, which is often quite limited, or it's always limited. Sometimes it's limited enough that we end up with an inaccurate concept. sometimes not only is it limited, but it's just wrong information. And then that obviously leads us to form a wrong conclusion. And it's also information experience that is processed by a relative instrument. The brain and all of its functions is in itself limited. And we tend not to relate to our conclusions, to our concepts, in a way that appreciates their limitedness. And instead, the body-mind organism relates to whatever it produces as an idea as if it is absolutely true. And so from a young age, we have been receiving pleasure and pain. The pleasure feels better. And so a concept says, oh, I need this. I need more of this. And that concept, held in the way that it tends to be held, which we can call belief, starts to create a belief-based sense of self, a belief-based identity that doesn't feel when the experience of that sense of self happens, which we all have experience of. It's what it feel, who we feel is living life, or who life is happening to. That feeling is often just the expression of this belief-based psychological me that was put in place. So it doesn't feel at all as though it's a belief-based identity, because the sensations, the feelings are very concrete. And so we say, what do you mean? The way I felt about how someone spoke of me. What do you mean that was belief-based? It felt very real and concrete. But if that set of beliefs about what we need starts to be weakened or altered, changed, if we start appreciating that what someone thinks about me in itself is a concept, and that if I don't buy into that concept, if I am free of knowing myself according to concepts, let's say, then what someone else thinks about me becomes irrelevant. But to the concept-based me, the identity that has been put in place over a period of time where thinking is not seen as relative, to that identity, all of these things that really don't touch what we truly are have a very significant effect. And so as those beliefs start to fall away, we start to experience something radically different, something that is akin to a different person living life. Because we are, by and large, a different person if certain deeply ingrained beliefs start to fall away. So today's topic is attachment to outcome, it seems. There is a saying in the Bible, and to me the Bible is any of the religious books, teachings of any religion, to me just represent wisdom in one of the very many forms that exist. So it's not about a specific religion. We can find this in all of the religions in different forms. I just happen to know the Bible and some of the Hindu teachings better than others. And the quote, the saying that I'm referring to, is that it is as difficult for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven as it is for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle. Now, unless it's a very big needle, it's very hard for a camel to get through that very small space. So essentially the saying is saying it is impossible for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven as impossible as it is for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle. Now, we tend to hear these things in a way where we take them literally. And so rich man to us tends to mean someone with a lot of money. The saying is not referring to a person with a lot of money. It's not saying that if you have a lot of money, you can't enter the kingdom of heaven. It sounds like it's saying that. Once, I guess, we start to appreciate the nuances in the metaphor, and especially when we start seeing it from our own experience, we would, if we looked at the experience and said, let me describe my experience, and if we refer to heaven as on earth, heaven on earth, being living life free of suffering, where suffering doesn't arise, and hell is hell on earth, where suffering is the predominant experience of life. So once again, the idea of heaven and hell is taken literally instead of metaphorically. So as we start to appreciate what these stories can mean when we look at them metaphorically, we'll realize that a rich man or a rich person is referring to someone who is attached to outcomes. It's about their attitude towards their wealth, and not necessarily just money wealth, but privilege or circumstance. And so really what it's getting at is that a individual with a certain attitude towards outcomes is unable to experience the freedom from suffering, which is heaven. They are non-congruent. If one's attitude towards outcomes changes, then the kingdom of heaven becomes available here on earth. I came across something on social media today, which was a saying from Ashtavaka, who is the sage that is central to the Ashtavaka Gita. And Ashtavaka was a sage that was deformed in 8 places. So Ashtavaka means 8, I think, or Ashta. And in the story of Ashtavaka, King Janaka, who is a very ripe seeker, finds Ashtavaka, and Ashtavaka becomes his guru. And the quote was, "Rare is it a person who can let go of the pleasures that they have experienced and doesn't hanker after or desire those pleasures that they have not yet experienced." And that is describing essentially the same thing. Rare is it a person not identified with outcomes. That identified with outcomes means rare is it someone that knows themselves free of the psychological self that gets put in place by life. Rare is it because life tends to keep reinforcing that until at some point when a person's destiny is, life starts to undo the attachment to outcome. And so when attachment to outcome is in place, when that identity is in place, it's impossible for us to feel at peace. It's impossible for us to not feel uncomfortable when different sorts of pains are delivered to us in the flow of life, including someone being rude to you, someone lying to you, someone taking something from you, someone not considering you, policy designed in a way that doesn't favor you, it raining when you want to go on a picnic, the full, your kids leaving things on the floor, if our identity is a certain way, still the way that life tends to form it, then there isn't an option of being at peace or accepting. So accepting is not something you can do. So we might say to someone, well, you just have to accept that life is pleasure and pain. Now, if that someone includes the psychological self that I've been describing, that is convinced that its completeness, not only convinced, but it feels that its completeness, what it feels is that it's incomplete in the moment, and it feels continuously incomplete as life continues to do what it normally does, which is deliver a mix of pleasure and pain. And so we're continually uncomfortable by the very nature of life, because it's not pleasure, 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 pleasure. And so that structure simply cannot accept. It's like telling fire to be cool. Fire can try to be cool. It's not going to work. So what's the point of hearing that, life is a mix of pleasure and pain? And what's the point about hearing about acceptance and non-resistance? They're not instructions for someone to fulfill, to carry out. They're not instructions of how you have to be in a forceful way. They're descriptions of what might happen. We might find acceptance starts happening. Now, acceptance can start happening when the process has done certain things that have changed us. And so at that point, if acceptance starts happening, we know that we are no longer the same person that we were when acceptance wasn't happening. So acceptance is an expression of who we are at a particular time, and it can only happen if certain structures have fallen away. And non-acceptance is an expression of who we are if the structures I've spoken about that can fall away remain in place. And so that attitude, just having that, so that's just a description. So if you find yourself in resistance to life, at least you have the description here. The description is, if I'm in resistance to life, that is an expression of my structure that I didn't put in place. So it can become understandable. There can be, if we can understand our resistance, then there is likely to be less resistance towards the resistance. If we don't understand our resistance towards a certain outcome, then not only will we resist the outcome, but we'll probably start resisting our resistance to the outcome, blaming ourselves for blaming the other. So blaming the other is resistance to the circumstance because the other has delivered pain. My sense of self is about pleasure. The sense of self feels attacked by the other. It's like, you did this to me, and that is an attack on my whole motive MO in life. Modus operandi. And not only is what I'm looking for that will complete me, pleasure, you've come in and you develop pain, but because we see ourselves as this independent entity that is in control, rather than understanding that we are a biological instrument designed by life that is functioning a very particular way, the only way we can, and that it's largely automatic, when we haven't tended to appreciate that yet, especially when that identity is in place, then we see the other in the same way. And we say, you hurt me and I hate you because you could have done it differently. And so the pain delivered by the other is seen to have been perpetuated entirely by their free will and volition, which intensifies the sense that it is an attack on who you are. So not only is it depriving you of what you need to be complete, to be content in life, but it's personal. It becomes personal, you against me. What a disaster. But anyway, if that happens, it's not your doing. It's something that is that movement is forced upon you. And if it's understood, if a section of our structure gets that, which is really because new conditioning comes in, and the new conditioning that says, hey, when you are in full resistance, that resistance is not something you are doing, but that is a happening based on this psychological structure that's in place, this psychological identity. If something in your system gets that, not only is it a weakening of that psychological structure to some degree, it is what can allow the relaxation or acceptance of resistance when it happens. So that means we might still blame the other because they have delivered pain that is seen as an attack on who I am. But when we go to blame ourselves, something comes up and says, it's not your doing. It's a happening. You know, if you could do it differently, you would, because it would free up this uncomfortableness. And eventually that attitude of non-doership starts to be extended towards the other. And we see how the other is just an instrument through which the destined amount of pleasure and pain that we're destined to receive in life is being delivered. And that's what's happening all the time, whether it happens through the other or through our own actions or through forces of nature. Life is always delivering changing circumstance, and that is either pleasure or pain. And so as life changes, our beliefs, which essentially is part of our up-to-date conditioning, it is changing the psychological self. And as that psychological self gets weaker, we find ourselves more capable of what we can call, and when I say we find ourselves more capable, it starts to happen. What starts to happen? A resting in what feels like a dropping out of the thinking mind into being. And from that place, it's like, who cares? You know, the biological, of course, still has to endure the pain, enjoy it. But beyond that, the thinking mind doesn't kick in and saying, can you believe that this is what is happening in the world? It's like it knows that the world has always been happening, and the world has never been free of drama and free of great things and very not great things. And so it doesn't get involved in the variety of life, the circumstance of life, in a way of trying to control and change it, because it just understands that that's futile. And if it was futile and yet we remained uncomfortable, then a non-involvement, probably a stopping of the involvement, probably wouldn't happen. So the stopping of the involvement happens because we find essentially a new source of self. Well, it's not really a new source of self. It's that the old sense of self has dissolved, and that old sense of self was looking for a source of contentment in the future, a source of contentment by imagining a different past. And that kept us very identified and involved, and feeling like circumstance was all important. And if we find that that identity is replaced by a different experience of life, where what we were looking for is here, is delivered, then the search, the craving, the importance placed on outcomes has to just not be there. So in line with that sort of thinking, where something is directly coming out of something else, so not even cause and effect, but a sort of an expression of, or another side of something. So the seeking for pleasure is an expression of another side of the psychological self that inherently feels uncomfortable. They're not separate things. It's a movement that comes out of the psychological self, and they're not separate. Another of these sort of interconnected movements, which we tend not to appreciate, and it's pretty important when we start seeing it, is the question that arises: what is the point? Or what is the purpose? Why are we here? Often stems out of a disconnection, out of an uncomfortableness. And from the uncomfortableness, where we aren't content, the question of what is the purpose, what is the point, is coming in order for us feeling like I need a solution to this feeling, or what is the solution to this feeling? If I knew the answer, then this feeling wouldn't be there. And what we fail to realize is the question only arises when that feeling is there. If we see that, we might start to realize it's not a valid question. When we think that finding the answer to the question will deliver contentment. So when we're looking at it as it feels, which is there is something missing, and I need to know where to find that missing thing. And so we figure, if I know what my purpose is, then I won't feel like there is no purpose, or like I haven't found my purpose. So when we look at it like that, it seems like a very valid question. When we see that the question stems out of an uncomfortableness, out of our uncomfortableness, and we realize that the question is not ever going to deliver something that will fulfill something missing, and we realize that the feeling of uncomfortableness, if it falls away, is a falling away of the sense that something is missing. And so when there isn't suffering, the question, what is the purpose, what is the point, doesn't arise, because we're there, and life itself is the purpose. Life itself in that moment is the point. When that peace gets covered up, and when I'm talking about peace, remember, I'm not talking about a feeling of peacefulness. Much more simple. It's just the absence of suffering. You know, you spend a day and you didn't blame someone, you didn't feel shame, you didn't feel anxiety, you didn't have expectation. You just felt connected and in flow with source and life. And even that is highly misleading, because feeling in flow and connected to the source, all of that implies feeling as something added. But really, I'm talking about the end of the uncomfortableness, the absence of the uncomfortableness. And when that's the case, the question just doesn't arise. So I'll invite some questions if people have any questions, and I'll round off the last few minutes of talking, saying that, so the talks, and there's hundreds of recordings on YouTube. If you go back to some of the earlier ones, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, you'll find the framework delivered in probably a more cohesive start to finish framework, because I wasn't delivering it after a year or two of doing so many talks. And so I felt like it was important to put forward the framework with its general concepts as a block. And so if you listen to the earlier talks, you get a more comprehensive feel of the overall framework. And you can intersperse some of the later talks that go into some of the nuances a little bit more with those general talks. So it's very important to realize the talks are not about God or about life per se, but about happiness in daily living. And happiness, as I've mentioned a lot in this talk, is actually peace of mind in daily living. And what is peace of mind? It's not something. It is just when the other experience of life, which is peppered and interspersed with the feeling of suffering and uncomfortableness, guilt, blame, pride, worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcome, all of which, when we get down to the root of it and we feel all of those as they arise in relation to outcomes, are an uncomfortableness with oneself or the other, and ultimately always an uncomfortableness with oneself. So peace of mind is the absence of that movement. And we find that that movement of suffering is always based on our attitude to the flow of life. And the flow of life is essentially circumstance, pleasure, or pain. And if the attitude towards life is an attitude of attachment to outcomes, I need pleasure in order to be happy, that is effectively coming from the ingrained false sense of who we are, a sense of who we are informed from a place where there isn't a connection to what we really are. And so then a whole lot of ideas that are not that true get put in place. They form beliefs and they become that identity that essentially gets strengthened. And the second part of the attitude that leads to suffering is that I am the doer. I am a separate, independent entity in complete volition of everything I think, is the most important part. We don't see our thoughts as something that I didn't create. We don't see our feelings as something I didn't create. We don't see the words as something I didn't create. I, as in a doer in control, right? That's how we see ourselves. I am a doer in control of all of these things. And that attitude makes us feel like independent, autonomous entities, which basically means separate, insulated from life, that we are our own entity, not influenced by anything except me. And that's the separation. That's where we have psychologically, we psychologically see ourselves as separate from life, which is not at all the case. That these words are a result of the genes and up-to-date conditioning, the body-mind organism, and that body-mind organism is intricately part of life. So we hear from ashes to ashes, dust to dust, is implying that out of the ashes comes the tree or the human being, and it will return the ashes. And it's not just, poetic. That is stemming from a fact that we start off as a separate, or not really, a sperm and an egg that come together and then grow into these amazing vehicles through which consciousness functions. And the vehicle is taking us on a ride, so we are being lived. And what is aware of all of that is the consciousness, aware of the feelings that arise in the body-mind organism, the words that come out of the body-mind organism, the actions that happen through the body-mind organism. And so that attitude, appreciating that on a deeper and deeper level as we think about it more and more, and it becomes more and more obvious. And the way it becomes obvious is through layers. I mean, oneness for someone will start off being a thought about oneness a particular way, and we go, oh, wow, life is all connected, could be a form of oneness. And that will eventually or will morph into different seeings of what oneness means. And is it all about oneness? I mean, I think oneness is important because it allows our attitude towards ourself as the doer to fall away. It allows a shift to the witnessing perspective that can become aware of the oneness, and that witnessing perspective is part of the core of the human being that is not dependent on outcomes. So I don't think it's all about oneness per se, but the recognition of the oneness of life is instrumental at undermining the beliefs that are the psychological identity. So in summary, it's very important if we realize what we're really looking for in life, liberation, enlightenment, is simply a shift where we come to know ourselves differently, where the primary significant change, the practical change, is that we move from living in life full of suffering to living life free of suffering. Circumstance isn't going to change much. We're going to function more or less the way we functioned before. We're going to have the personality more or less as we had before. It's just that our attitude towards ourself, the other, life, changes radically, such that the resistance, the non-acceptance, the uncomfortable feeling inside falls away. And that's the simple peace of mind that we've all been looking for, whether we realize it or not. I say that because that is happiness. And when it sets in, I was going to say this earlier on, I don't think I did, when it actually sets in for ourselves, that's when we get to say, oh, this is what I've always been looking for. And until then, just like the Stone Age caveman has an idea about or an opinion about what the tractor is, until then, we have an idea or an opinion about what happiness is. And when I say the happiness we are looking for, whether we realize it or not, is happiness through peace of mind, what it means is when that sets in, that's when we say, now I know from my experience, not as an opinion based on what I think happiness is, but what I know happiness is this, and it's all that we ever really need, because it's the end of the uncomfortableness. And when the uncomfortableness falls away, the question of more of what is life about purpose, about all of these things fall away, and it becomes irrelevant. And so I think in last week's satsang, the thought of the Rumi poem came to me, and I hadn't thought about it for, maybe even 2 years. So I was a bit rusty on it. And then the next day I was driving the car and it sort of came to me, and so I haven't looked it up since. And now I'll probably put my foot in it, but I remember remembering it the day after the satsang when I had sort of forgotten it a little bit. And so this is just one of the stanzas out of the poem. And essentially it talks about what we've been talking about today. Out beyond the ideas of right doing and wrong doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. When the soul lies down in the grass of that field, life is too full to talk about. So out beyond the ideas of right doing and wrong doing is highlighting that the psychological self is a self that obscures the true self. It is a self based on belief, a belief that says, I need this and I don't need that. This is right and this is wrong. This is how you should be and this is how you shouldn't be. So that is the separating, non-accepting, resisting movement towards the flow of life that just is. It is the variety of good and bad, big and small, health and disease, wealth and poverty, interconnected opposites, duality. So the ideas of doing wrongdoing are the ideas that say life should be pleasure, 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 and no pain. So when that movement subsides, we find ourselves resting in being. And that being is where we know ourselves. We know who we truly are. And so that is the field out beyond ideas of right doing and wrongdoing. So Rumi says, I will meet you there, which is, that's where we can really know each other. Because we're not functioning through the veil of idea of who I am, and we've connected to something more constant, more true, more common to all humans. When the soul lies down in the grass, so really it means when we melt back into ourselves, into that true self, life becomes too full, meaning it is complete now. There is the sense that it doesn't need to become more than it is now. Too full to talk about, meaning there isn't anything to say because it's all irrelevant. It's like, yeah, who cares? Who cares about that? There's nothing to say. It's like, it's my own self is self-confirming, self-contenting. So the continuous chatter about life and how it should be, the continuous need to talk, to reaffirm ourselves, to get validation falls away. And we can reside in ourself and know everything is as it should be. So, hi Marlene.
Hey, Roger.
Hey, Roger.
Hello.
Hello. Should I leave my camera off or the? I don't know.
As you like.
Okay,
you can
then I'll
leave
switch
it on.
it on. I like to see you, so maybe. Oh, it can't. Okay. Well, we'll do it like this. Thank you for taking my question. It's about It's about I guess contemplation or related to the updating of conditioning. I wondered, I don't find myself really actively contemplating, really actively, knowingly thinking about new teachings I come across or new concepts, but somehow over a period of time, it appears or it seems that they some of them do sink in and become a part of my new conditioning. And well, I'll notice that in one way or another way because I notice my thinking about things or my knowing about things has changed. But is this just something I made up, or is it possible to contemplate in a more passive way, I guess, more just like it's cooking? I don't know how else to put it.
Yeah. The fact that a concept comes in and is heard by the system, even if it doesn't create additional or subsequent thoughts, extensions of the concept, if it comes in and it is heard, then that essentially is contemplation. So it's obviously it's different to the standard, because we think of contemplation as this extended thinking in time. But contemplation really means something is understood, or a process of understanding something. So if something gets understood very quickly, then I would say it's a form. It essentially delivers what contemplation delivers. What is more likely to be happening is that you are thinking about it, but in maybe such a relaxed way or such an informal way that you might not be registering it as contemplation. So you may think about something without appreciating that just the simple thinking about it in relation to ordinary life, maybe practical life, it might just pop up here and there as a thought, and so it doesn't seem like it's a orchestrated and concentrated block of contemplation. Is very powerful if it's happening like that, and as it happens like that, meaning coming up in little bits here and there in very informal ways, if that is having the effect of deepening, which I think it very much can, then that's what I mean by contemplation. And what's also really important is that the contemplation and the whole seeking movement really, I suppose, happens in a powerful way when there's no one doing it, when it's not a practice, and it just happens as a result of, you're driving in your car, you see something and a thought comes up, oh, that's pain in the moment, for example, someone drops their drink, and or you see someone bump their car into a pole and you go, financial pain in the moment. That's the understanding going deeper in a very informal way, and it's a sign, and there's no one doing it. Essentially, you saw something, the thought arises, and then you move on. Life moves you on, and that just means that the concept, the new conditioning has come in. It's become part of your up-to-date conditioning, and it's triggered, meaning it's at the forefront of your thinking, because we can have a conversation about something with someone and completely forget the content very quickly, where it doesn't come up. It's almost like we understood maybe the discussion in the moment, but the topic wasn't interesting enough, or it was used complex series of interconnections that we needed to understand, that we understood in the moment when someone was sort of holding it all for us. And then the conversation finishes. 3 weeks later, if someone asks you about the topic, it's like, oh, I spoke to someone about it 3 weeks ago, but I've got no idea what it was all about. And so then it's not going to come up in relation to things you see and hear and are doing, and therefore it doesn't go deeper and deeper. So I would suggest that's what's happening. It's just, and it's not, and maybe that thinking hasn't been appreciated as being very significant. And a lot of people that have peak experiences, that when they happen, feel like they have nothing to do with the intellect. In fact, a peak experience is sort of the intellect stops in a moment, and then the experience of life is quite different to normal, because it is not being influenced by a very particular type of thinking, which includes in it usually a particular sense of self. And so when these peak experiences happen, there is a real sense that I'm not doing anything, that everything is happening, that the intellect has no idea about the nature of life, for example. And those peak experiences often happen after a period of contemplation about a topic, even if the contemplation didn't get the peak experience right, because when we think about these things, let's say oneness, never really think about it the way it really reveals itself when it reveals itself. And so it seems like the peak experience has nothing to do with up-to-date conditioning, with contemplating, with thinking. But I say that that was a sort of culmination of that thinking process, which sometimes the culmination comes after we surrender. We've thought about it so long and we just go, I've just got to get on with life. This isn't working or whatever. And then a peak experience might happen. And so someone might say, oh, it had nothing to do with thinking. In fact, when I was thinking, nothing was happening, or I was feeling stuck. And then I stopped. So to me, the stopping is a result of feeling frustrated, recognizing the frustration, the intellect saying, I'm going to stop, I give up. So the way I see it, everything is a continuation of and significantly influenced by the intellect. And I'm talking about the working mind intellect by and large as well, the functional thinking that even recognizes, now my seeking is getting me caught in a loop and I'm just going to get on with life. That's a thought of the working mind. The functional mind has recognized something and it said, stop.
Sounds very familiar. Yes. Thank you. And yeah. I there was one more thing about this, which I was curious about. I sometimes have, when I have stumbled, well, maybe it's not stumble, but I must have been looking for it, some kind of teaching which really resonated with me. And sometimes after that, I have a couple of days of feeling like all I thought I knew before about this is not available somehow. I seem a little bit numb or something. Is that also related to maybe the new conditioning, that it's shuffled and I don't know. It's just now it feels very frustrating because I think it's a problem, but maybe I wonder, maybe it's just the updating of my conditioning, which is it?
Yeah, it there's a number of things. Is that I see the movement, the progression as like going up steps, and so you need to understand something for something else to build on itself, to build on that base. But at some point, it was spoken about in order to build the first base gets seen to be like quite rudimentary or quite basic, maybe even said in a way that you now see, oh, well, it was very useful that it was said that way. Very useful that I related to, I don't know, guides, for example. It could be very helpful. And then at some point, something else comes in, and that new information maybe in a way supersedes and makes the old less relevant. And that becomes the new building blocks. The new foundation is being built on which something else can then rest. So that can be one of the phenomena where we can almost say, wow, all that I believed is sort of being pulled away, as in we see it's not relevant. And now we're working with something new. There's also the phenomena of the flip-flopping, and which is different to what I've just described. And I suspect that it's the flip-flopping that you're talking about more so than previous teachings falling away because they've done their job and then something maybe more nuanced coming in. The flip-flopping is where some new information comes in, it penetrates something like a belief system or a structure and brings about a shift. And that can then stir up a whole new movement of the seeking. And the seeking movement is, we tend to go, let's say, from being quite settled and grounded in what we've been working with, where it's sort of delivered. We've done all the work on that layer and it's delivered something. Then we get something new that opens up sort of a whole new Pandora's box of things to be worked on. And that opening up of the box can include a moment of suffering energy and suffering identity that wasn't ready to move previously. Maybe it was too concentrated, too much, that we needed this other foundation built first. And then once that's built and it's deemed, okay, now time for the next bit of work. And so then a concept, a teaching is received by the system, and it opens it up. And then we have this movement of suffering energy that comes onto the conscious level. And once the conscious level is flooded with this new amount of suffering energy, that essentially is useful that happens, because it's bringing it out to be looked at. But nonetheless, it makes us feel very uncomfortable. It tends to mean that clarity isn't there, because suffering energy doesn't have clarity in it. And it's essentially the foundations that have been laid by the earlier phases that allow in time that energy to be processed. We'll then essentially come to a position where we feel comfortable again, and because we've done the work on that level, and maybe it then starts again, because we've been ratcheted up another level, essentially, which is the other way of looking at it, is we're going deeper and deeper down into the psyche and dealing with more and more of these psychological belief, false idea, false sense of self structures.
Yes, it's the flip-flopping. This is very helpful. Thank you so much, Roger.
You're welcome. Thanks for dropping in. Hi, Miriam.
Hi. See, I'm not sure if I want to ask the question, but so mine is pretty much about fear, and I feel kind of bad bringing it up, but I feel like I need to. So I don't know if I should just kind of give you an idea of what brought it on, or if I should just say it's about fear, and then you just kind of talk about whatever comes to you.
Whichever you
prefer. Yes.
Okay. We have some feedback, on your side, I think. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. Basically, in 2007, I met a spiritual teacher, and I was very new to spirituality and everything, and so that was wonderful. But I feel like there was a lot of ego and wanting to experience and everything in the beginning. I followed her up until like 2012, when suddenly I started to feel like I really, since the beginning, because it was a different tradition to me, like I felt like I tried to be open to the tradition, but in the background, I always felt I'm from like a Christian, very casual Christian background. So there was always something in me that just kind of like wanted to be okay and with everything, even though maybe I wasn't fully. So in 2012, I just felt like I needed to take a break. And so I did. But when I did, I started to experience deep fear, and it was really hard. Like I'd never experienced anything like that before. But that went on for like a year until I decided to just go back to the teacher. And once I did, everything was fine. But so from 2013 on, I've been with the same teacher, and I was doing like 4 or 5 hours of bhajan singing and meditation technique, and also chanting 3 times a day. That was, lots. And but just recently, like, and I was full on, gave myself full on. And so now, just like maybe a month ago, something just started, right? The same thing started rising up again. And I felt like I've given myself, part of me feels like I've given myself because I love her, but at the same time, part of me feels like I forced myself in some way. And I'm conflicted because I don't know what's going on. I don't know if my ego is pushing me out of the way, or if maybe I've been feeling like I need truth is what I just want, some form of truth. I hope that's the truth. And so now I felt like I couldn't lie to myself anymore, because this is something that's obviously been in the background for so long. And I just feel like, maybe not that there's anything wrong with the traditions that I try to become open to it. It's just, I'm feeling like maybe for me, that's not in alignment with how I feel inside. Like, there's a lot of rituals and there's a lot of chanting, and a lot of that came in conflict because I felt like it's almost like manipulating in a way. It's almost like trying to, I don't know. And there's nothing wrong against, I don't know if you understand what I'm saying. It just didn't feel right for me. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it, but it just, yeah. And so now I have a lot of fear and anxiety because I've just recently stopped everything, and it's just, I don't know. I just feel like I want to uncondition. I feel like I'm just done with religion, and I just want to be with what I need to be with, but I don't know what's truth.
Right. So let's see if we can get rid of this feedback, because if I talk, I think it's going to...
Oh, what's the feedback? Do I look at the...
It sounds like there's a volume on it, your side, but it maybe it's past now, so it seems like it's okay.
Okay.
I'll tell you if it comes back. So to me, one of the reasons that we are seeking truth is because intuitively we know, as you put it, that we've been lying to ourselves, you could say, or not being truthful to ourselves. And one of the versions of that not being truthful to ourselves is not doing what we feel like, where we are essentially living through fear, through we're doing things because of being afraid of the consequence rather than doing it because it is authentic to us. So this movement to want truth is really a movement, I think, in part pushing us away from shoulds and shouldn'ts. So the shoulds and shouldn'ts are what society tells us life is, what society tells us how we should be, what the other parents, teachers, government, friends tell us how we should be, what we should do, what life is about. And at some point we really start feeling, I don't want to live through this conceptual world of shoulds and shouldn'ts that I've bought into. And the shoulds and shouldn'ts are there because it's our strategy of how to get safety, how to get love, how to get pleasure, essentially, because we believe that that is what is most important. And so then we say, okay, I need love, I need security, I need safety, I need outcomes to be pleasurable. The best way is for me to agree with this person, to be nice to this person, to act a certain way in front of people. And we essentially compromise what is authentic and genuine in order to manipulate or think to try and get what we think is important. It turns out that what we think is important, outcomes, is not at all where we will find happiness. And that's why this intuitive feeling towards truth, or away from shoulds and shouldn'ts, away from attachment to outcomes. And so fear is a fear of what will happen, which is an outcome, right? If I leave a relationship, what will happen? And so often people stay in relationship because of fear rather than because they want to be there. And as that builds, it has a sort of cumulative effect on us to the point where it gets too much and we say, I'm not going to do it anymore. And until that point in time, the fear is stronger and the fear wins. And so we don't change. But once that cumulative uncomfortableness builds up and it becomes stronger than the fear, then we have a real motive to say, I have to do it, right? And we then find ourselves capable of moving in a direction that we previously weren't capable of moving in. Now, that doesn't mean that the fear won't still be in the system, but we have hopefully some inner guidance that says, this is important. This is what I need to experiment with. This is what I need to introduce into my life, because if not, I just remain in the same course and the same hamster wheel, the same rut that I've been in, that is not taking me anywhere. In fact, what it's doing is increasing my sense of disconnection, my sense of inauthenticity. And so hopefully where you're at is at a phase where that yearning for truth stays with you and allows you to pursue something that is more authentic, which sounds exactly when you've described it to me as leaving, is a freeing yourself from something you don't entirely resonate with. And that's very important. So I would encourage you, to the extent that you can, which is really not something that you or I are in control of, because the fear versus the yearning for freedom, the yearning for truth, that will dictate which wins. And so if you experiment, if you try something and it doesn't work, then your system will reassess. And so at any point, you're free to go back. If the teacher tells you can't come back, then I would question, the attitude behind the teacher. But that's a different story. The point is, once you make a decision, at any point, another decision is available whenever you like. So you can remain doing what is authentic to you, because going back at some point with the experience of having left, going back may be something you say, this is what I want to do. This is what feels authentic to me. And so if that happens, you can do that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Hi, Peter.
Oh, hi, Roger. How are you? Do you hear me? Hello?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
And you?
I'm good. I'm good. Thank you. Yeah, I'm not sure how pointed my question will be. I kind of threw up my hand a little bit impulsively, but I guess it's one of the sort of questions that's been swirling around is when it comes to the difference between and I think you've addressed this in many times, and yet the question still arises: sort of the difference between contemplative thinking and sort of the thinking mind. So I find myself sometimes going between the two modes of thinking, if that's the correct terminology. Sort of, let's say I've been sort of becoming more aware of, certain energies, let's say sort of suffering energies or longing or sort of, in all of its various forms, regret, all these energies that come up, and they almost have a physical, they almost manifest themselves physically in some cases. Mm-hmm. So I'm sort of interested in them, to varying degrees of consciousness. I think I'm not always so conscious, but I'm sometimes when I am conscious, and then that will sometimes go down a rabbit hole of sort of self-analysis and of myself or analysis of another. And then I find myself in this sort of world rabbit hole of suffering and regret. But at the same time, I'm like, well, this is maybe, instructive. Maybe I'm learning something here, or maybe I should just put a stop to it and, stop this futile sort of thinking. So then it goes back to the question, where does contemplation and the thinking mind, begin and end, I guess.
Yeah, well,
maybe that's the impossible question to answer.
Well, to make it simple within the context of this framework, we know the difference between the working mind and the thinking mind based on what those thoughts and in their concentrated form, because thought in a very concentrated form doesn't feel like thought. It feels like a feeling. So what do the thoughts and feelings, what sense do they have? Do they have a sense of uncomfortableness, so bitterness, and, an uncomfortableness with who I am? And if that's the case, then it isn't contemplating according to this concept, but it is the thinking mind in action. And if it has doesn't have that, then it's not the thinking mind. So, if someone might say, well, it's not the thinking mind, it's functional thinking, because I'm looking back on the past and I'm seeing how poorly I performed and how unkind I was and how inconsiderate I was. And I feel ashamed at that. And so it's the functional mind, because I'm looking at all these things, realistically. But when you look at it, really what's happening is it's the doership, the claiming I am the one that could have and should have been better, that is assessing the past, but very much maintaining an attitude of personal doership in it, which means shame is coming up, resentment to the others for their role in it, or simply shame for yourself if it's just about your action. And essentially, that's exactly what the thinking mind is. So in that case, it would be an idea of, or a notion of what the working mind is, which is a mistaken notion that is essentially covering up or relabeling suffering as the working mind, which is not that it's not that great, because it is a means of perpetuating a lack of clarity, right, according to the concepts. But if that happens, it's completely understandable, because we have a very deeply ingrained way of thinking that is sort of forced upon us. And it might require a discussion like this for there to be more clarity about, oh, even if I'm thinking about the past and looking at it, what we think is objectively, if that objective look at the past is then being contaminated or interspersed with notion of I could have been better, I should have been better. Not I could have been better, because in theory, of course, we can always do things, or things could have acted. It's not that things could have been different. That's what we have to see, is that sure, we can look at something and imagine it differently. What we have to appreciate is that life is this this environment, this petri dish, where infinite forces are acting on everything in that environment. And so that means that infinite forces are forcing us to function that way. And so when we look back and say, oh, if only I had functioned differently, what we're doing is we're ignoring the fact that infinite forces are forcing everything to be exactly the way it is, or the way it was. Right. And so when that's understood, that's when the understanding of non-doership starts undermining any thoughts of suffering, because the thoughts of suffering are always saying, you as a doer should have done better. And seeing it each moment as an outcome of infinite forces means actually history played out the only way it could. Not just Peter's history, but all of history.
No, that concept has been very comforting, has definitely dispelled a lot of discomfort. That's what was is it a follow-up question that I had regarding that? What was it? Oh God, I guess I can't have been that important. It was related to that, though, the idea of, I guess it's not a follow-up, but it's the idea that, I get into this mode sometimes where, and it comes from that suffering essentially. And maybe, like you said, this idea that, I could have done things differently, and things could have been, but this idea that I have to figure something out about myself, like this is, I have to figure out why I'm acting, or why I sort of engage in these recurring patterns all the time. In order to sort of free myself, I have to sort of understand this pattern that I'm sort of keep playing out. And then, to be honest, since I've been sort of listening to you, and it's definitely diminished that impulse, but it's still there. And I guess, I think I know your answer is that there is no figuring it out in a sense. That's what I tell myself when I catch myself, is like there's just, it's a futile. But I guess there is that part of me which, some kind of awareness of my pattern and my life will help me sort of have some clarity around how I'm behaving, and what I'm doing, and how that may be hurting others. And
there's a difference between contemplating when we're free of suffering and there's clarity, and thinking that we can contemplate or sort things out when there is suffering in the system. So on the one hand, say there's nothing to do, when you're in a suffering storm, everything that is considered, the information you're receiving about what you need to sort out, any conclusions you form, basically are all going to be infected by and affected by that particular perspective in that moment, which is the suffering. So not much work to be done there. It's sort of like preparing for a fire or a disaster or something when it's upon you, instead of you can't do it. So the contemplating and the deepening of the understanding tends to happen in the gaps in between the suffering. There are some people, and I don't imagine you fit into this category, that swing back to, become interested in spiritual teachings basically when things don't feel good. And then when things feel good, they're not interested anymore. It's sort of like help when the shit's hit the fan. And it requires the strengthening of those muscles in between those periods. Right. So in the period itself, what we need to appreciate is that everything that we're thinking, like what we think is the problem, is not the problem, because we think it's the problem based on the feeling, and the feeling says you need to fix yourself. And so then it says, okay, so how are you going to fix yourself? Come up with an answer. And it feels very authentic. It feels like, yes, that's what I need to do. I need to come up with an answer. The real freedom has nothing to do with you fixing yourself, but rather when that energy that says you're not good enough like this, you need to fix yourself, things need to change. When that falls away, that's the answer. And you haven't fixed yourself. You haven't changed yourself. So the best suggestion, which is just a description once again, because it's not something you can do. If you're in that storm, and it's forcing you to be involved in that thinking and think you need to fix it, then that's what's going to happen till it subsides. So it's not really me saying stop buying into it, because I know you won't be able to sometimes. But what it is it's just a description, becomes part of your up-to-date conditioning, and it can be something that happens from time to time where you just say, let me not try and find a solution now. I have plenty of time when there's more clarity. And if a part of you still keeps going, maybe a part of you is allowing that part to keep going, and that the part that's withdrawn says, I'm withdrawing to find a solution another time. And so that part is the witness of maybe a part of you that is still, trying to find a solution in that moment. And that will only strengthen if it starts.
Yeah. Okay. That's, thank you very much. That's encouraging.
Great.
Yes.
Well, you're very welcome. I'll take one more question, the last one. Hi, Lauren.
Hi, Roger.
Laurent.
Yes, okay. Happy to see you and ask a question. I have two questions. A quick one. Your satsang on Wednesday afternoon, are they over or not? We are 2 or 3 that happen to come, but there is nobody. And it's written on the site that there is still the satsang on Wednesday.
Yes, I'm very slow at changing these things. So I'm just doing it once a week now on Saturdays.
Okay, it's finished. It won't happen again. Okay, and about the question, you are speaking of the peace, this inner peace, and I understand what you say, and I feel it. I feel it's true, and it's good for me. But on the other way, perhaps I don't understand it very well. It seems to me that you are saying that it's possible to have it all the time, practically. It's possible to change of condition. I haven't this peace, and if conditions change, perhaps I will get this peace. And it, how can I say it? It seems to me that during the day, I have this peace for a while, then I lose it, and I have it again. So my question is it possible that it becomes always peace, or will it last as it is?
It's possible that it will become only peace, but it's not necessarily what will happen. We're not in control of what happens, but if you look at the movement, you can see there is more peace than there used to be.
Yeah.
From in the day, there are, and in those periods, there is the absence of a certain entity or a certain identity, a certain relationship to the world. It just, the thinking, a certain type of thinking just isn't there, right? So if someone says, what do you think about, X, Y, and Z? You say, well, I haven't been thinking about it. It just didn't come up. And that is peace. And then when the suffering comes in, what happens is we see, that like a certain narrative, a certain music or sound, being our thinking, comes back in, and it has a certain effect, which is an uncomfortableness. It makes us feel like there is right and wrong, and this shouldn't be happening, and we get involved and maybe feel anxious or blame, shame, all of that. And so why is it that it happens sometimes and then not other times? Or why is there peace sometimes and then suffering at other times? And my explanation is that the identity is getting weaker. The identity that suffers is getting weaker, but it hasn't fully dissolved. And so some people will say, this notion that there can be unbroken peace of mind is ridiculous. Now, I can agree that it's not worth being attached to continuous unbroken peace of mind, because if we set that up as the most important objective, when there is suffering, sometimes, then we are going to resist the suffering, and it's going to make the suffering worse. So I think we have to, that's why I said it is possible, but it's not necessarily what's going to happen. And if we can hold on to the notion, it's possible, but I don't know if it's my destiny, means that when there is sometimes peace and then it becomes suffering, then we say, so it is my destiny for there to be suffering now, so nothing to do about it. And hopefully there isn't a resistance to the suffering that says, I should have got it by now. Why is this still happening? And that's what would happen if we set up continuous unbroken peace of mind as the only valid way of living life. Then we're forced to resist the suffering. What I don't agree with is the notion where someone says, you can't have complete peace of mind. I say, well, if you see your suffering is getting less, what makes you say it can't stop? Because it's getting less because certain identities, certain beliefs are falling away, are changing. So if that change process continues to happen, doesn't it make sense that at some point there's nothing left? Especially if it's a general principle that is changing and that there are layers to that principle. If we get to the bottom of the principle, then all the suffering that sits on top of it eventually can fall away once that root is completely dissolved. So, you know, that's the explanation of why it's still there, I think, is because the root has started to dissolve, and maybe not, I don't mean just the first 5%, it could be the first 60 or 80% has dissolved, and there's still a core part of the root that is alive and functioning at certain parts during the day. So on the one hand, it's a good sign that the peace is presenting itself. If you can see that there's a certain attitude, a certain understanding in those moments when there is peace, if, for example, you see that in those moments something negative happens, a painful outcome, and your thinking says, you know, well, this is not the end of the world. And then at other times, something negative happens and you see the energy is that it gets, you know, you're forced to feel like it's the end of the world. Then you can say, well, at the times when there is peace, I realize that my completeness, that who I am is not dependent on outcomes. And that's an attitude that, especially if you recognize it and you put your finger on it and you say, that's one of the things that is different. When there is peace, it really doesn't feel, or not even it doesn't feel, outcomes are not what determine how I know myself. And that's an attitude that can keep getting deeper and deeper, which means less and less suffering.